One of the most important lessons in my life is that almost everything I was brought up to believe turns out to be untrue. Now, I don't blame my parents for this. In fact, I don't blame anyone for this. They, just like everybody else, was brought up with the same founding, justifying.
Kann jemand rausfinden, wie ich die Untertitel wieder heller kriege? Ich habe die den Tag irgendwie aus Versehen dunkel gemacht.
All classes have them, all groups of people subscribe to them, and they're always wrong.
Wir gucken die Geburtslotterie. Eine Schröcksche Empfehlung.
We do not choose to exist. We do not choose what environment we will grow up in. The people we become, the lives that we lead, the beliefs and values we learn to hold, owe much to the lottery of our birth. Our starting point in life is one of reliance on forces over which we have no control. Long before we can shape the world has firmly shaped us.
Mhm. Das ist ja auch eine der wesentlichen Erkenntnissen aus dem... Habe ich es hier noch irgendwo? Ja. Vom Robert. Der hat ja, also der hat eigentlich alle Aspekte, die relevant sind, sozusagen hingebrettert. Die sozusagen, bevor wir überhaupt auf der Welt sind, schon reinspielen und reinkicken bei uns.
But what we are shaped into is no accident. For though our entry into this world is arbitrary, the world that greets us is not.
We've evolved, first of all, to pay attention to our parents.
Daniel Dennett, unser Lieblingsopa.
We're all born almost fully fledged.
Übrigens, Daniel Dennett ist Kompatibilist. Das heißt, er weiß, dass es keinen freien Willen gibt, aber er benutzt es gerne als hilfreiches Modell. Und er glaubt aber in Wahrheit, wenn man ihn genau fragt, dass der freie Wille doch irgendwo herkommt. Also aus der Quantenmechanik oder so. Also typisch Kompatibilist halt, ne?
As citizens, as members of a particular class, citizens of a particular country.
Hallo, Busenfreund.
Believing that that's the only way it can be and the only way it will always be. But of course, the context into which we are born is one which has been highly engineered by particular political and economic forces.
The environment we grow up in provides us with its own picture of reality. A set of beliefs and values, prejudices and biases tied to particular symbols and particular labels. While they may link us with some, they can separate us from many more.
Uh-huh.
And so completely do we learn to identify with these symbols and labels, some of us will kill or die for them.
I think by our very nature, we're apt to be less skeptical than we ought to be. We tend to accept the background assumptions, the values of the culture that we're born into. People like to believe things that put them or the group they belong to in a good light. Everyone thinks they're on the side of the angels. Realizing that you are apt to think better of yourself and your gender and your religion and nation than you ought to is the first step towards getting an objective assessment of what you and your group are like.
One of the things that most effectively blinds us to our own role in the world and to our examining our own beliefs and our own actions is patriotism, or indeed adherence to any pre-established view of the world. But patriotism has a particularly effective role in preventing us from knowing ourselves, because you begin with the assumption that you are the best and most desirable country in the world. That's the central assumption of patriotism.
Also diese Doku ist natürlich an Amis gerichtet, ne? Aber gut, ich meine, diese Probleme haben wir überall, aber bei den Amis ist es halt wirklich spezielle Form von Dummheit, ne?
Of course, it can't be true in all cases. It's probably not true in any cases. But it allows you not to see the bad things your country is doing and not to see the impacts that it exerts on other people. Patriotism is always conceived as a virtue, and as a result, it's a particularly powerful force in blinding us to certain realities.
Imagine two enemies on a battlefield. Suppose it were possible to go back in time and swap them at birth, so that each child would be raised in the other's culture. In time, would each not end up fighting for the other side? A different flag?
Sie reden hier nicht über das Konzept vom freien Willen, noch nicht zumindest, ne? Wir haben ja schon Daniel Dennett gesehen und so, es deutet sich schon an, aber was meinen Sie mit Swappen, ne? Meinen Sie damit auch Erbmaterial und quantenmechanischen Zustand, oder meinen Sie nur nach der Geburt das Krankenhaus geswappt? Was meinen Sie jetzt damit?
Religion? A different ideology?
I think it's a source of great tragedy that we're apt to believe our own self-serving story, to sincerely believe that we are seeing the world as it is and that other people are deluded or dishonest or impervious to reason. And you can have two people sincerely believing opposing views about themselves and the other side.
I think the
George Orwell, unser
reflection
alter Anarchistenfreund.
on the conditions that control you in order to be free to act as an autonomous agent, a sovereign agent, with as deep a knowledge about the world in which you are, is absolutely vital. But this self-reflection cannot come from within the chains of control that bind you, that lock you in. Therefore, you need an opening. And an opening can only come through experience of relationship. It could be relationship with nature, it could be relationship with other cultures, but it is relationship outside the box which locks you in.
We come into this world with the potential for a wide range of behavior. Much depends on the soil in which we grow. The difference between the towering tree and the decaying seed may be no more than environmental. History suggests that there is neither a belief too bizarre nor an action too appalling for humans to embrace, given the necessary cultural influences. This idea, though simple, has profound implications for our personal and political freedom. In an important sense, we are not born free. In fact, to take our freedom for granted is to extinguish the possibility of attaining it.
if you have a society, it's going to have certain roles and certain positions available. That's just inevitably the case. That'll be true forever, as long as we have societies. So education you can view in one of two ways. You can say education is this process by which people arrive at the capacity to utilize their skills and talents maximally and to enrich their lives and so on. A positive view of education. Alternatively, you can say education is a process which prepares people to fit positions in society. It gives them the information and the attitudes, the personalities, the inclinations, the expectations that are consistent with the positions that they're going to fill in society. Now, actually, the second is inevitable, but you want the first. So to have the first, it must be that the positions that people are going to have in society need for people to be their most fulfilled and accomplished and capable selves. But that's not the case for typical societal structures that we now have.
Also ob es jetzt wirklich inevitable ist, das wage ich zu bezweifeln. Aber gut.
So the school system has to teach you to endure boredom. It has to teach you to take orders and to obey. And so that's what it does for 80%. So there's a contradiction between fitting the slot and being the best you can be, so to speak. To have good education, to have liberating education, society has to have slots that are for free people, that are for initiating and caring human beings.
Systems of education must prioritize certain ideas, facts, and behavior over others. These priorities tell us much about the dominant values and goals of a society.
In the United States, every student
Ja, das ist total idealistisch. Also ich meine, das ist halt die Geschichte, die vom Bildungssystem weltweit erzählt wird, ne?
learns about the Boston Massacre. 5 people were killed in the Boston Massacre. They do not learn about the massacre in the 1860s in Colorado, where hundreds of Indians were killed by an American Army regiment.
Maddox, wir gucken die Lottery of Birth, also die Geburtslotterie. Das ist eine alte Doku.
As soon as I
Es geht, denke ich, nur um
began to study history,
Kapitalismuskritik.
I realized
Das hat Schröck schon mal
that the
gespoilert.
history that was given to me was a history determined by the historian. The lectures that were given to me in class were lectures whose content was decided by the teacher. And so I came to the conclusion that the important distortions in history come not from lying, that is, not from telling falsehoods about history. The important distortions come from what is omitted from history.
Klar.
Comes from the process of selection,
Eben.
in which certain things are selected.
Das ist exakt das, was Stefan Schulz auch immer bemängelt an den Medienoutlets in Deutschland, ne? Dass sie immer völlig falsche Aufmerksamkeit auf die völlig falschen Dinge richten und niemals den Kontext mal hinbrettern, wie es ist.
Because they're palatable, because they're useful for the selector, and other things, because they might cause trouble, are not selected. So I decided very soon in my own work in history that I would recognize this fact. I would not disguise whatever history I was doing and make people think that I was giving them objective, neutral history. Inevitably, the history I present would be my point of view. And therefore, I wanted my readers, just as I wanted my students when I was teaching history, I wanted them to know my work was biased against racism, against war, against economic exploitation. This is my point of view. I have decided that this is the important thing to tell you. You should know that this is not objective. This is partial. The Columbus story has been presented for generations to young Americans in school as a story of adventure, nobility, courage. Columbus, the great hero, because he very bravely crossed the ocean and found this land in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, so many things in the United States are named after Columbus. There are many cities, and there's Columbia University. There are statues of Columbus in various parts of the country. What is not told to young people in school is that Columbus was a predator. His main goal was Well, the main goal of expansionists anywhere, to move into another territory and to seize the riches of that territory. And in the search for gold, he subjected the Indians that he met in the Bahamas to terrible cruelties. He mutilated Indians. He killed them and kidnapped them. These indigenous people actually lived in a very benign society and reacted to the coming of Columbus with generosity, bringing gifts and so on. That side of the Columbus story is not told at all. And there's a reason for that, because if it were told in its truth, then it might make young people question.
How many American students are taught that between 1945 and 2005, the United States attempted to overthrow 50 governments around the world, many of them democracies?
If you talk about atrocities committed in the colonial period by
die Doku ist von 2012 oder so.
Most people will just stare at you blankly. They have no idea what you're talking about. If you talk about Stalin's atrocities, they're fully apprised of those. But Lord Lytton's in India probably killed as many people as Stalin did by very similar methods, exporting grain in the midst of a famine. Huge quantities of grain, often from places where there was a surplus of production, very successful harvests, and engineered a famine in which tens of millions of people died. But we hear nothing of this. We know nothing of this.
How many British students learn about the work of the historian Mark Curtis? Drawing on formerly secret UK government files, he estimates that Britain is complicit in the deaths of over 10 million people from countries around the world since 1945.
Schooling can't be politically neutral because it's preparing people to play a role in society, and roles in society are not politically neutral because they affect the distribution of power. It's either preparing you to empower those who already have power by increasing their authority, increasing the distribution of their ideas, or by increasing their wealth. If you're trained to serve them, then you've been trained to play a political role. If you're trained to pursue your own vision, to develop your own vision first and then pursue it, then that's a political role also.
In the 1960s in the United States, there was, of course, like most places in the world, an upheaval, a gigantic social upheaval of resistance and opposition to the past, to the structures of capital and power that existed in society. The government, of course, the elites confronted a problem. They didn't want this to recur.
In 1973, at the behest of billionaire David Rockefeller, an organization known as the Trilateral Commission was founded. Its early members were drawn from the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. Among them were the heads of major corporations, banks, law firms, and government. Concerned about the resistance of the 60s, the Commission set out to investigate its root causes. Their report was entitled The Crisis of Democracy.
And this commission did an investigation focusing on education and on school systems because, of course, so much of the activity occurred on campuses. And they actually came up with a conclusion. It wasn't the totality of the reasons for the 60s, but it's quite revealing, and it was one of the reasons. What they said was the population was being overeducated. That's an incredible kind of idea, and yet it's accurate. They were saying, and they were very clear on this, that we were educating people enough so that they actually expected to have a life, so that they expected to have a degree of control when they got finished with their educations.
Ist ja furchtbar.
And what they were encountering was their ability to control their own lives was...
Und ihr wisst, was die neoliberalen Reformen gemacht haben, ne? Sie haben sozusagen absichtlich die Rezession herbeigeführt, damit endlich wieder Arbeitslosigkeit groß wird, damit die Leute endlich wieder jeden Scheiß fressen, um zu überleben und nicht in ihrem Luxus schwelgen und so.
Was marginal, and people resisted.
Die wollten einfach jetzt auf einmal was. Das geht natürlich so nicht.
And what they decided was that they had to make a change in the educational system. They had to cut back on the high quality education that they had until then, under the pressure of Sputnik and the rest, been spreading through society, and instead increase the more regimented education.
The report regarded the education system as the most important value-producing system in society, and argued that a program is necessary to lower the job expectation of those who receive a college education.
Herrlich. Wenn das mal nicht eine False-Flag-Aktion ist.
Within 2 years of the report's publication, all of the top positions in the US government, the office of President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Defense, and Treasury, were held by members of the Trilateral Commission, and the National Security Advisor was its director.
Ja, so geht's. Da war einfach zu viel Demokratie, korrekt. Man braucht weniger Demokratie.
You know, education quite clearly replicates control in many, many ways. I come from a country that was colonized by Britain, and one of the instruments of control was education. Because education can...
Guck mal, in Deutschland hatten wir auch den radikalen Erlass. Ja? Und der war spezifisch nur dazu gedacht, alle progressiven Linken aus dem öffentlichen Dienst zu entfernen. Damit keine Lehrer mehr da sind, die irgendwie links sind. Damit man nur konservative Scheißfaschos hat.
Either free the mind and encourage independent thinking, or it can control the mind and condition the mind and basically turn you into slaves who voluntarily give up their freedom because they don't know how else to be, how else to think.
An education that omits what's needed to understand power thereby protects it.
Ja, genau.
Most of us will pass through school without a single lesson on the roots of inequality, the influence of corporations, or the workings of capitalism.
Ja, klar. Kann man ja nur krank
By
werden von der Scheiße.
rewarding certain attitudes, abilities, and behavior, while punishing others, schooling discourages deviation from its prescribed path.
Logisch.
Our world is transformed by the work that we do. But most of us have very little control over the aims, conditions, and availability of this work. When employed, we use our time and creativity to serve agendas set by others.
The decisions that professionals make in their work has much, much more influence on society than the way they vote every 4 years in the voting booth. If you look at people's lives, you'll see that their work really is the most important project. You rarely find a project.
Alles von dem, wie heißt er denn? Also der war ja auch mal bei Dillinger Escape Plan und so. Heißt der Peterson? Ich glaube, der heißt Patterson. Der hat bei übelst vielen Projekten mitgemacht.
On which people spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, minimum actually. You're selling the best hours of your life. You're selling the biggest project in your life. You're selling your biggest interaction with society. Professionals are deliberately produced to be intellectually and politically subordinate.
Yes.
The distinguishing feature is their willingness and ability to maintain ideological discipline in their work. Yes, they are skilled.
Sonst kommen sie nicht dahin, wo sie sind.
A lot of non-professionals are skilled too. The work of a non-professional can be and is specified in a manual. The manual shows what to do in all the possible situations that come up. Whereas professional work has no manual. Professional work is creative in that sense. A journalist, for example, there's no manual that tells a journalist even what the first word of a story should be. Employers assign the ideology to the professional, and then the professional goes about creative work under the guidance of that assigned ideology.
Ja.
So professionals are doing creative work.
Das ist das Beste daran, ne? Die Leute glauben an diese Fake News, die sie verbreiten. Ja, wenn man jetzt die Welt aufmacht, die sind wirklich geblendete Volltrottel. Die haben in dem Sinne keine Aufklärung genossen, sondern sind einfach nur Kapital reproduzierende Volllappenkinder. Mike Patton heißt er. Genau, Mike Patton.
Framework that's dictated by their employers. Teachers, for example, get awards for finding new and innovative ways of conveying the curriculum to the students. But the curriculum is dictated by the employers. So they're doing creative work, but they have been stripped of political control of that work. The journalist's angle on a story, the historian's depiction of events, the accountant's bookkeeping decision, the language that the lawyer uses in a contract or in an argument, the minister's sermon, the teacher's lesson, even the speechwriter's joke tilts one way or the other, and the way it tilts is never an accident.
In any profession, once you actually become involved in doing it, and if you want to do it, it's terribly easy to get caught up with the natural everyday logic of pragmatically doing the job, and you fail to stand back and look at the context within which you're doing it. I came up through tabloid newspapers. I was taught to select stories and angle stories and to write stories with a view to selling the paper. I took that for granted. I thought that's what journalism was about. And I think it was years of working without thinking before I stepped back and thought, well, hang on a moment. I'm supposed to be a journalist, not a salesman. And if I make these crucial decisions about what story subject to cover and with what angle and at what length and on what page and with what language, if I make those kind of decisions on commercial grounds, I'm out of step with the kind of journalistic judgments that I should be making. And those journalistic judgments really aren't commercial, they're moral judgments. But I'd been doing the job for years before I really thought that through.
Ja,
In the
five
course
filters
of
of
my
Mass
research
Media,
for
ne?
Disciplined Minds, I came across a newsletter from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is one of the 2 nuclear weapons design laboratories in the United States. The interviewer asked some young nuclear weapons designers, "What is the worst thing about your job?" And these young guys paused to think, and they thought, and finally they said things like, "Oh, the computers. They don't have enough capacity and they're always going down." Things like that. Very narrow.
Ja.
To me, this was a great illustration of the subordination of professionals.
Und das ist genau das, was wir gerade in der letzten Doku gesehen haben, ne? Das erzeugt diese hochglanzkarätigen 5-Sterne-Generalingenieure, die in ihrer Tätigkeit aufgehen und nichts beitragen. Hm? Eigentlich sogar kontraproduktiv sind, weil sie allen anderen Peers und sich gegenseitig sozusagen verstärken, diese Geschichte erzählen, wir machen hier irgendwas.
Wasn't their job or even their interest to question the big picture, to wonder, maybe the worst thing about my job is that I'm making...
Noch schlimmer ist ja eigentlich, dass sozusagen extrem viele krasse Nerds, die gut nachdenken könnten über alles Mögliche, vom Finanzwesen geschluckt werden, um da irgendwelche High-Frequency-Algorithmen zu bauen oder irgendwelche Deep Learning zu trainieren. Einfach nur zum Zwecke der Kapitalakkumulation. Ne? Das ist eine totale Verschwendung von dem ganzen menschlichen Potenzial, was wir da haben.
More dangerous place, that I'm setting up disaster by designing weapons of mass destruction. They didn't comment on that at all. In general, questioning the goal of the work is not considered to be a legitimate part of the work assignment. People are not supposed to question the moral work of their employers.
Ja.
As a young child, I knew I wanted to be a physicist. Einstein was my inspiration. And in those days of the 70s, the highest level of physics was to join the nuclear establishment, which is exactly what I was training for. And I was spending my summers in the Bhabha Atomic Research Center and feeling very smug, feeling very cool about what I was doing. I was the first woman in the fast breeder reactor when it was going critical. And I came home and with excitement was sharing this with my family. And my sister, who was at that time training to be a medical doctor, just asked me a very simple question. And what about the radiations? And started to talk to me about what nuclear radiation does to the human body. And I realized in that moment that I had learned the best of nuclear physics, but not one class had I been taught on nuclear radiation and its hazards. And that's the day I decided that I didn't want to learn a one-sided science.
Das ist ja
I wanted
frech.
to learn the whole. I wanted to have a holistic idea of what I was studying, and that's what shifted me to theoretical physics and the study of the foundations of quantum theory. But that's the wake-up moment for me to know.
Aber ich kann mir schon vorstellen, wenn man irgendwie in Indien so einen spezialisierten Scheiß studiert, dass das dann wirklich so eng ist. Das ist merkwürdig, ne? Gerade bei einem Grundlagenfach, wo theoretische Physik eigentlich sozusagen Standard ist. Ne? Also alles bis zur statistischen Physik ist Standard. Ne? Festkörperphysik, Elementarteilchentheorie ist, wird eigentlich auch immer noch gemacht, ne? Bloß die advanceden Sachen, was weiß ich, relativistische Quantenmechanik oder so, zweite Quantisierung, so ein Zeug, das wird dann meistens sozusagen, das kann man machen, muss man aber nicht.
That there is a very partial window that is opened for you. And that partial window numbs you to the impact of your actions. And so often, the best of scientists have absolutely no idea
Ja,
what.
und das ist ja das, was ich immer sage, ne? Wir haben diese Sache mit der Verwaltung. Jede Verwaltung hat einen eigenen disjunkten Part der Realität, den sie verwaltet. Das heißt, es gibt keinen Überlapp von Verwaltungen. Das heißt, es gibt keine Emergenz, die sie abbilden können. Übelst viel liegt in der Grauzone, niemand ist zuständig. Und so ist es beim Studium auch, ne? Du hast hinterher einen Haufen Fachidioten und es gibt keine interdisziplinären Gedanken da drin. Es gibt einfach keinen Überlapp. Und wenn, dann wird er sozusagen auch noch aktiv verhindert. Also es ist sozusagen schwer, Karriere zu machen in etwas, was interdisziplinär ist. Es ist viel einfacher, Karriere zu machen in irgendeiner speziellen Sache. Das ist halt scheiße.
Their actions are doing. It applies to today's biotechnologists and genetic engineers. They feel so happy that they now can move genes across species barriers, but they have the worldview of a petri dish. All they can see is these cells in the petri dish. They have no experience of a real plant, they have no experience of real soil, and they have no relationship with real farmers whose lives they are destroying.
Citizens in a democratic society enjoy the freedoms of speech, privacy, and association. The freedom to vote out leaders they do not like and elect ones they do. But employees seldom enjoy these freedoms. Instead, they are subject to a strict chain of command and close monitoring. To enter the workplace, the rights of the citizen must often be left behind.
Mach die Babsi.
Well, in the economy, there's no democracy at all. There's not even anything that can remotely be described as democratic. Rather, in a typical corporation, the owners, the people at the top of the corporate hierarchy, make the decisions, and their will is law. Stalin never dreamed of telling people when they could go to the bathroom. Owners of companies routinely lay down laws and rules about how often or when you can go to the bathroom. Owners have a level of intrusive control over the daily life situation of people in the economy that is just incredible. You're basically just following dictates and structures that are imposed by others, doing work in which you have almost no say over what you're doing, over any of the circumstances or conditions of what you're doing. So in that domain, in the economic domain, the discussion can't be about that. If it's about that, if there's really an honest discussion about the amount of say.
Discipled Minds. A critical look at salaried professionals at the soul-battering system that shapes their life. Jeff Schmidt, ja? Das ist jetzt ein Buch, oder was?
Say everybody has, and the level of democracy, well, then the whole thing is corrupt and would have to be thrown out.
The system of education and employment doesn't require you to internalize its ideology. It just requires you to maintain ideological discipline. In other words, in your work, you abide by the ideology of the employer. All day long at work, you could be writing advertising copy, praising a product, and then after work, you could tell all your friends that it's a piece of junk. Don't buy it. However, this doesn't happen very often. You may have heard of the Stockholm Syndrome, a name that comes from an incident that happened in Sweden where a bank robber took a bunch of people hostage and held them for a long time. When they were finally released, the former hostages spoke very favorably about the person who had held them at gunpoint under threat of killing them. People found that very peculiar. Well, it's simple psychology that it's safer to take that position. These people maximize their chance of not being killed by becoming sympathetic to the person who had the life and death power over them.
Logisch.
Well, the same thing happens in the workplace. The safest way to survive in the workplace is to internalize that ideology.
Na klar.
Well, in life, what happens, you realize you have to, if you want to survive, you have to fit in with the structure as it is. If you want a job, you have to please the person who employs you. If you want to get on, you've got to give people confidence.
Na, und diese sozusagen, diese First Level oder First Order Idee davon, wie man jetzt Survival, so Coping-Strategien bildet und Survival-Strategien bildet, ist natürlich Banane, ne? Weil die Schlussfolgerung daraus ist, die einzige Lösung, daran was zu ändern ist, in der Hierarchie hochklettern und dann die Regeln runterkleckern. Das ist der Trugschluss, ne? Dass es keine Alternative dazu gibt, außer die Hierarchie hochzuklettern. Dabei gibt es einen Ausweg, ne? Und das ist das typische Unionizing. Sich verbinden, quasi horizontale Verbindungen zwischen den Groups machen und die Hierarchie vergesellschaften durch Druck. Ne? Das geht aber immer schlechter in einer mehr atomisierten Gesellschaft, und wenn die Leute sozusagen, je ärmer sie dran sind, desto einfacher ist es, sie zu unterdrücken, ist ja klar, ne?
You are not going to disturb their lives in any way. And so the structure as it is becomes more attractive to you.
Ideological conformity is often seen as politically neutral because it's so common. If somebody is not conforming to the dominant ideology that dictated by the employer, then people say, well, that person is getting political, as if that person wasn't political all along, serving the employer's ideology. So, yeah, it's kind of insidious when people who are working day and night to support the status quo are seen as non-political.
A hierarchically structured workplace demands that we sell more than our time and knowledge. It demands that we sell our obedience.
Mhm.
The more skillfully we conform to the logic of the system and obey the agendas of those above us, the more power we will attain.
Ja, und das ist, worauf die Leute immer nicht eingehen oder was sie nicht verstehen bei diesem Filterprozess ist ja, dass das Komplement, also Leute, die das nicht tun, nicht nur nicht groß werden in diesen Hierarchien, sondern nicht nur überhaupt existieren können. Das heißt, das Ergebnis eines solchen Filterprozesses ist, dass alle Teil dieser Ideologie werden. Ja? Alle anderen fallen ja raus.
Throughout life, people are trained to obey parents, teachers, and employers, to obey the laws of society's gods and governments. This obedience pushes power up the social hierarchy. More power is concentrated in fewer hands.
Na, und das Problem hierbei, darauf habe ich ja schon oft hingewiesen, die Datenkomprimierung. Ne? Je höher der Rang, der soziale Rang, in dem sich eine Entscheiderposition befindet, also eine Turing-Maschine, ein einzelnes menschliches Gehirn, der Datenstrom, der von unten ankommt, der ist exponentiell, ne? Der wächst mit dem hierarchischen Rang. Das heißt, es muss Datenkomprimierung stattfinden, damit da noch eine Entscheidung getroffen werden kann. Die Datenkomprimierung ist typischerweise oberflächliche Kennzahlen, das heißt, die Entscheidungen, die getroffen werden, basieren meistens auf einem unterkomplexen Weltmodell und dann kann das nicht funktionieren. Ne? Auf Dauer kann das nicht funktionieren. Die Feedback-Loops, die man da in Gang setzt, die sind alle instabil und dieses System ist auch unfähig zu lernen, weil Informationen, die von unten nach oben durchgereicht werden, typischerweise manipuliert. Die kommen nicht als Rohdaten an, ne? Die werden komprimiert. Das ist einfach, ja. Wenn man das programmiert, sieht man sofort, dass es nicht funktionieren kann.
Without mass obedience and conformity to the demands of power.
Und so ein Lappen wie Stalin am Ende, ne, dem hat niemand mehr was gesagt.
Soldier to the journalist, lawyer and intellectual. In July 1961, Professor of Social Psychology Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University to investigate people's responses to a recognized authority. The initial motivation for the experiment was to understand how German citizens were able to carry out the crimes of the Holocaust during World War II. The original experiments were filmed. Two people come to a psychology laboratory in a prestigious university. One of them is designated teacher, the other learner. The experimenter explains that the study is concerned with the effects of punishment on memory and learning.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where?
Ja, wir hatten ja auch vor einer Zeit lang die Kritik am Milgram, ne, dass der viel Cherrypicking betrieben hat und so. Aber weiß nicht, also ich meine, es ist ja irgendwie trotzdem völlig klar, Autorität muss hinterfragt werden. Ne? Wenn man was aus der Aufklärung mitnimmt, dann das. Und der Witz ist, unser Schulsystem, zumindest in Deutschland, hat ja den Selbstanspruch, aufgeklärte, demokratische Menschen großzuziehen. Ne? Aber unser Schulsystem gibt diesen jungen Menschen überhaupt keine Werkzeuge an die Hand, um das überhaupt zu erfüllen, wenn überhaupt das Gegenteil, ne? Die werden einfach nur zu ganz normalen Soldaten erzogen. Das ist komplett bescheuert, ne? Wir haben nicht aus dem Holocaust gelernt, heißt das eigentlich. Und ich meine, wir sehen es ja. Die Mehrheit in allen Bundesländern ist schwarz oder blau.
Now, each time he gives a wrong answer, you move up one switch on the shock generator. And of course, we'll begin with 15 volts for the first wrong answer. Okay? Do not begin until I say.
Wobei natürlich die Nichtwähler immer nicht mitgezählt werden, ne?
Attention, learner. Your teacher is about to begin the test. Try and remember the word pairs.
Ja, Zirkel, wir hatten das schon, dass die Kritik am Milgram-Experiment.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Red.
Next one.
I refuse to answer.
Well, you gotta keep getting a shock if you don't answer. Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. Next word is sad.
This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich boy.
Necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing. Please continue. Go on, please. You accept all the responsibility? The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Genau.
Gold. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
I think we ought to find out what's wrong in there first. The experiment requires that you continue, teacher. Well, the experiment might require that we continue, but I still think we should find out what the condition of the gentleman is. As I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous. Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay. It's absolutely essential that you continue. Well, essential or not, this program isn't quite that important to me that I should go along doing something that I know nothing about, particularly if it's going to injure someone. I don't know what this is all about. Well, whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs correctly. Well, you can sure have your 450 back. I didn't want it anyhow. I intend to give it to some charitable organization, but I wouldn't go on with it. The 450 is not the issue here. That check is yours simply to come into the lab. It is essential that you continue the experiment. No, it isn't essential. Not one bit. You have no other choice, teacher. Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice.
Die NS-Zeit ist das bessere Milgram-Experiment, auf jeden Fall. Und ich finde auch das Aftermath, also wie darüber sozusagen nachgedacht wird in der Öffentlichkeit, diese Verlogenheit, diese völlig verklemmte Art und Weise über Antisemitismus und strukturellen Antisemitismus zu reden. Die Antideutschen, die CDU, diese ganzen Bürgis, ne? Alle zusammen. Wie sozusagen in der BRD gerade, noch der Geheimdienst und so. Das alles, die Parteien, die Altnazis, wie damit umgegangen wird, ne? Die CIA, der Kalte Krieg. Das ist alles hochgradig, tendenziös. Ne? Da braucht man kein Milgram-Experiment.
Choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Well, of 100 people placed in this situation, how many do you think would just go right on to the end?
Well, personally, I think if you get one or two, you'd be lucky.
Prior to the experiment, a group of psychiatrists predicted that only 1 in 1,000 would continue to the last 450-volt switch. Almost 2/3 of the participants pulled every one of 30 shock switches, continuing until the researcher ended the experiment. Over the years, the experiment has been repeated many times in several countries, all with roughly the same results. Analysis of the data has found that the percentage of participants who are prepared to inflict fatal voltages, irrespective of gender, remains remarkably constant at around 65%.
Ja, und wir haben ja daran nichts geändert. Ne? Also unsere Gesellschaftsstruktur basiert immer noch darauf, dass Leute einfach nur ihren Job machen und Verantwortung nach oben abgeben. Und da oben passiert nichts mit der Verantwortung. Denn Verantwortung ist eine Illusion. Wir haben sie doch überhaupt gar nicht institutionalisiert. Sie existiert nicht. Wir können sie ja sehen, dass es nicht stattfindet.
Kind of pattern of behavior that you learn, or perhaps is instinctive, perhaps is automatic. But the idea is that you have certain schemas that are triggered automatically that come into play in certain situations. So you can get schemas of varying complexity. But the idea is that we have these roles and we learn them so that as adults, a lot of the time we're just switching from role to role without requiring very much conscious thought or effort. The thing about a schema is everything's kind of mapped out for you. I mean, I think about the brain, and a lot of people I think do, as people think about it as a thinking machine. I think the point of the brain is actually to minimize the amount of thinking that you have to do. Thinking is conscious and consciousness takes effort. So if you think...
Also das ist korrekt, ne? Das Ziel des Gehirns ist es, die Aufmerksamkeit eines Tages auf Null zu drehen, ne? Dass wir komplett ins Nirvana AFK gehen können, weil alles automatisiert ist. Das ist aber erst dann der Fall, wenn wir das Surprisal komplett minimiert auf Null gesetzt haben. Das heißt, wenn wir niemals überrascht werden, weil wir schon vorher wissen, was passiert. Ne? Das ist aber die Kostenfunktion, die optimiert wird. Ne? Unser Gehirn versucht ja, Überraschung zu minimieren. Natürlich kommen wir da nie an, aber eine AGI könnte da ankommen. Ne? Eine AGI könnte irgendwann bewusstlos werden quasi. Also ja, das stimmt natürlich. Ne? Das ist das Ziel.
About it instead as a device.
Deswegen haben wir schon so viele Shortcuts und so viele Sachen, über die wir nicht mehr nachdenken. Ne? Und ständig machen wir irgendwelche Fehler und hinterher stellen wir fest, haben wir das jetzt gemacht oder nicht? Haben wir jetzt den Herd ausgemacht? Keine Ahnung. Wie war das eigentlich letzte Woche, als ich mit dem Fahrrad dagegen gefahren bin? Ich habe es schon völlig vergessen und so. Warum bin ich da eigentlich gegengefahren und so? Ne? Unsere Steuerimpulse, alles Mögliche ist schon eine einzige Statistik und wir wissen schon gar nicht mehr genau, wie sozusagen die Sache mit dem freien Willen sich eigentlich noch konstituieren soll, weil es halt eine Illusion ist und so, aber wir erzählen uns trotzdem die Geschichte, dass es stattfindet.
For minimizing the amount of effort that you have to put into things, and learning rote patterns of behavior is one way of doing that. So you can, instead of thinking, okay, now what do I have to do in this situation, you can think, just do this. You know what you've done it before, you just flip into the pattern and then that's easy. Effortful thinking, deciding what to do, consciously weighing options, that takes a lot of work, takes a lot of brain work. And so your brain is, if you like, has evolved to minimize the amount of work, minimize the amount of consciousness. So you don't actually have to put that much work into deciding what you're going to do in every situation. You just know that, you know, this person's the boss, and when you're with a boss, you behave in such a way, and when you're with your children, you behave in another way. You can just switch easily from schema to schema.
Natürlich, Identitäten, swappen.
Disobedience does not imply disorder. In fact, it is obedience that produces the most destructive forms of disorder: war, poverty, and the devastation of our environment.
Korrekt. Diese Schlussfolgerung habe ich im Buch auch ein paar Mal schon dann gebracht, ne? Krieg ist nicht möglich ohne Machthierarchien, die Menschen überhaupt kohärent dazu bringen, sich von ihrer eigenen Natur so weit zu entfremden, andere Leute umzubringen auf diese Art und Weise, ne?
We live in a world which is already moving in certain directions, and a world which is not a blank slate, a world where people are being oppressed, a world where wars are going on, a world where the children are going hungry. If you think you are being neutral by doing nothing, you are deceiving yourself. You are not being neutral.
Korrekt. Das ist auch eine Schlussfolgerung aus meinem Buch. Aber ich habe es ja auch schon ein paar Mal gesagt, ne? Das ist einfach nur das Ignorieren von Verantwortung, ne? Klar.
You are collaborating with whatever forces are dominant in a society, collaborating with whatever trends already taking place.
Keine Ahnung, Christina. Also ich weiß nicht, was wir danach noch gucken. Wir gucken ja dann nachher noch mal ein Video, das ist Hierarchiekritik Teil 3. Totale Dystopie, weiß nicht. Normaler Content, oder? Normal, wir gucken uns halt eine kapitalismuskritische Doku an.
Society. So there's no such thing as neutrality in a world which already is subject to many, many different kinds of forces, and so many of them malevolent.
To question and disobey one set of laws or principles is to adhere at the same time to another set.
Emma Goldman.
Freedom has always depended on our
George
ability
Orwell.
to identify and overcome systems of arbitrary authority. Throughout history, principled disobedience has time and again served to create a more humane society. The choice is not whether we obey or disobey, but rather what we obey and disobey.
Oh yes.
The surface reality of society can often be deceptive. Familiarity can blind us to the oppressive structures shaping our world.
Ja, den Eindruck habe ich auf jeden Fall, ne? Also, das ist eigentlich überall, was wir beobachten können, ne? Es wird permanent nur darauf geachtet, die Machtdynamiken und die Machtgradienten zu verschleiern. Damit nicht klar wird, sozusagen, was jetzt eigentlich Phase ist und wo sozusagen der Einfluss herkommt. Sondern es wird immer alles anonymisiert und dann zum Beispiel so einem Objekt wie dem Markt überlassen, der aber so eine ominöse, träge Masse sozusagen lenkt. Dabei ist das Schwachsinn, ne? Also auch die Märkte sind quasi ja nicht frei, wissen wir ja und so. Die werden quasi durch Monopole und hier und da und Angebot und Nachfrage ist sowieso ein Mythos, wissen wir ja. Weil wenn es so wäre, dass sozusagen Angebot und Nachfrage irgendwas sind, ne, dann wäre die Welt komplett anders. Ne, wir haben ja eine riesen Nachfrage nach, was weiß ich, gesundem Essen oder irgendwie Bildung und so. Und Kunst und Kultur und so ein Scheiß. Und Menschenrechten. Wir haben ja eine Nachfrage nach diesem Kram. Aber das ist überhaupt nicht das Relevante. Das ist überhaupt nicht das, was wir beobachten können. Ne?
The more we're a product of these structures, the more likely we are to internalize their values and conform to their expectations. The knowledge we possess and the values we hold emerge from the interaction between our brain's cognitive architecture and our experiences. Since there is no politically neutral way to socialize people, the versions of reality we are presented with tend to serve the agendas of those who control what is presented.
Ja.
Our minds are a battleground of competing forces. The outcome of this battle determines the society we create. To shape these minds is to shape the society.
It's that unacknowledged control which makes good people do bad things, because they are driven towards certain actions by ideologies that they do not know they possess.
Mm-hmm.
Often you hear people saying, oh, I'm not at all political. And very often it's the people who claim to be least political who are actually most political, because they have taken on board a whole series of unacknowledged assumptions which, because they believe they're not political, they never challenge. Without self-questioning, self-examination, without rigorously and fiercely testing your own beliefs and your own preconceptions, you can't meaningfully test those of society as a whole. But it's a very painful process. We hate that sort of self-scrutiny. We hate being scrutinized by other people in that way. But without it, there's no possibility of progress. Without it, we can't become a juster people. We can't produce a society which is fairer, which has better outcomes for everyone.
Mhm.
We can't protect the people who are currently mistreated. We can't.
Ja, das ist das, was Babsi vorhin geschrieben hat, ne? Es gibt Leute, die sagen, wir wollen unsere Lebensgrundlagen schützen. Und andere Menschen sagen einfach nein. Das ist alles, ne?
Protect the environments which are currently being trashed. It begins with self-examination.
Just as it's important to study, the history of your society, of your culture, of your nation, I think it also very useful to study your own history, your own personal history. As an individual, you have had a very limited set of experiences, and the limitation on your experiences may have then set a limitation on your thinking, may have narrowed your thinking. And to recognize those limitations, to recognize that you may have been limited by your family, by your education, by your church, by the class in which you were born, to recognize the limitations of your personal experience is to then enable you perhaps to go beyond those limitations.
It can be frightening to take on the task of questioning your most deeply held beliefs.
Genau. Danny Dennett, mein Lieblingszitat ist ja, there is no polite way to tell someone that he has dedicated his life to an illusion.
Partly because you might discover that you've been living a lie or been duped. People don't like to learn that about themselves. There's a tremendous bias in favor of maintaining the status quo, what's familiar, what's secure.
I looked at newspapers that were published in Texas during the 1890s, at a time when the ideology of racism was so thoroughly embedded amongst the readers of those newspapers that the newspapers naturally and spontaneously picked it up and reflected it back. So they did, for example, news reports about lynchings, where they described the public murder of young black men with no kind of fear or conscience or hint of the immorality of these public murders. They reported them as though they were reporting a football match, as an absolutely natural event. Mm-hmm. And by looking back historically from an era in which the ideology has changed, we can see just how powerful it is, that it's there. And the interesting thing about the ideological impact on news coverage is that it's invisible. It's embedded in the foundations, taken for granted.
I think that understanding ourselves is a prerequisite to just about everything that's valuable in life, to enlightenment, to cooperation, to escape from the self-deception that mires us in conflict and argument.
Ja, also ich bin ja jetzt mittlerweile auf dem Stand, dass sozusagen nur die wenigsten Leute wirklich mal mit reiner Information was anfangen können. Ne? Die meisten müssen Erfahrung machen. Es reicht nicht, Sachen zu wissen oder zu verstehen oder so. Oder sagen wir mal, schon verstehen, aber verstehen funktioniert bei den meisten Leuten nur, indem sie den kognitiven Prozess des Erfahrens durchmachen. Der Stoffwechsel, Metabolismus der Informationen muss wirklich durchdacht und erfahren sein, um dann sich einzuprägen und verstanden zu werden. Von den meisten Leuten. Und ich hatte das vorhin auch im Discord mit irgendwem, dass sozusagen Initiationsriten in unserer Gesellschaft fehlen. Ne? Wir haben keine Initiationsriten. Das heißt, Menschen haben nie diesen Ego-Tod und wissen nicht, dass sie die ganze Zeit nur Rollen spielen, sondern wir haben infantilisierte Erwachsene, die sich benehmen wie scheiß Kleinkinder und einfach mal die ganze Zeit offended rumlaufen und denken, Wunder, was sie ausgeschissen hat, nur weil sie eine Meinung zu irgendwas haben und ständig angepisst sind, weil sie nichts können. Und einfach mal zu glatt sind, irgendwas zu raffen. Und anstatt einfach das negative Feedback anzunehmen, dass sie irgendwie zu doof sind, das kriegen sie nicht hin, ne? Sie sind es gewohnt, kasualisierte Inhalte zu konsumieren und das soll auch bitte schön so bleiben. Und ja, wir haben keine Initialisationsriten, ne? Wir haben nur so bescheuerte Besäufnisse im Westen. Das ergibt alles keinen Sinn. Und ohne irgendwie eine moderierte Art und Weise jungen Menschen klarzumachen, dass sie einen Ego-Tod sterben müssen, bevor sie erwachsen sind, um dann einzusehen, dass man sich auch mal selber zurücknehmen muss, dass man auch mal anerkennen muss, wenn man was falsch macht. Ohne eine Kultur, die das macht, kann man wahrscheinlich nicht weit kommen, ne? Das ist sozusagen absolut anti-aufklärerisch, was im Moment passiert, weil wir uns die Geschichte davon erzählen, dass wir aufgeklärt sind. Wir können aber beobachten, dass sozusagen keine Gemeinschaft dafür gefunden werden kann, die irgendwie aufklärerisch tätig sein will. Beziehungsweise wir sehen sozusagen, dass wenn irgendwie die Bevölkerung befragt wird nach irgendwelchen Dingen, dann schon die ganzen Sachen irgendwie bejaht werden, von denen wir wissen, dass sie eigentlich wahr sind und dass es wichtig wäre. Aber daraus folgt nichts, ne? Es gibt keine Konsequenz. Und ich denke, die Leute geben einfach auf, sozusagen, sie sind ohnmächtig. Und zwar, das System hat sie zu ohnmächtigen Leuten gemacht, ne? Dieser Kapitalismus, Realismus, dass wir uns nur eine Dystopie vorstellen können, aber keine Alternative zum jetzigen System, das sagt alles, ne? Und ich denke, Teil des Problems ist, dass sozusagen die Machtstrukturen permanent verschleiert sind. Die Machtstrukturen sind verschleiert und die Tatsache, dass alles in Machtstrukturen eingebettet ist, es wird ja permanent verschleiert, zum Beispiel durch Wirtschaftswissenschaften, ne? Dass Preise was mit Machtstrukturen zu tun haben. Das wird verschleiert, ne? Es wird so getan, als wäre alles im luftleeren Raum, perfekter Wettbewerb und so, Informationen sind doch da, man muss doch nur rational handeln und so ein Schwachsinn, ne? Alles Esoterik, kann man nicht beobachten.
Chekhov once said, man will be better when you can show him what he is like. And as a
Hallo,
psychologist, I
Ewigkind.
think those are words to live by.
If there is one lesson to be taken from the violent horrors of the 20th century, it is the danger of not questioning. But we won't ask a question if we think we already know the answer.
The ideal of science, which we were taught when we began, is that you fail. You come close to truth, you hope. But there's always going to be somebody who's going to come closer. You're always prepared.
Ja, deswegen, ich sag ja, dieses Prinzip der Rationalität. Alles zu Steelmannen, sich selber permanent die Frage zu stellen, was könnte an dem, was ich mir gerade denke, völlig falsch sein? Kann ich es irgendwie falsifizieren? Und das, was durch diesen Filterprozess noch durchkommt, ist sozusagen das, was ich von dem ich gesichert weiß, dass es das Beste ist, was ich habe. Diese Form von Filterprozess, der in den Wissenschaften sozusagen eigentlich propagiert wird. Diese Form von Rationalität, ne, die geht den normalen Menschen völlig ab, weil wir Konsumenten sind. Und Konsumenten brauchen Kasualisierung. Ne, wir kultivieren quasi das Gegenteil von dem, was die Aufklärung uns eigentlich gesagt hat. Deswegen ist diese Aufklärung, von der wir hier immer reden, einfach nur eine Propagandakampagne. Das ist Fake. Es existiert einfach nicht. Es wird nicht kultiviert. Es wird bestraft. Und jeder von euch weiß das. Wenn ihr in eurer Jugend irgendwann mal aufgemuckt habt, dann gab es einfach nur richtig Stress. Das wird eben nicht belohnt. Sich richtig verhalten wird nicht belohnt.
To be an error. And I mean, the scientific ideal is the professor who stands up after 30 years of working on a theory and says, this theory is wrong. And I have seen somebody do that in a meeting and be applauded. You know, that's the ideal. It does have a lot of power. And it's this sense, again, of testing yourself against reality and being prepared to accept reality's judgment. Problem with any
ich habe dazu ein Video gemacht, ne? Die wohl wichtigste Fähigkeit die wohl wichtigste menschliche Fähigkeit. Doppelpunkt, Rationalität. Oder die Fähigkeit zur Rationalität oder so.
Belief, if you like, is that if a belief is part of your identity, if it's very important that you are who you are because you define yourself in part by that belief becomes a part of yourself. And so, if you're trying to jettison that belief...
Schröck, ich meine mit Initiationsritus nicht unbedingt einmal richtig krass traumatisiert werden in diesem Sinne, so wie du das schreibst. Ich meine damit, dass man bemerkt, dass man, also im Buch habe ich das so genannt, Opfer von Gewalt werden ist unausweichlich. Und das ist eine anthropologische Konstante. Damit müssen wir copen lernen. Ne? Diese naive Vorstellung, dass man sich davor schützen kann, ist Schwachsinn. Und das andere ist, dass damit einhergeht, dass wir halt wirklich permanent Rollen spielen. Und man muss einfach mal die Tatsache anerkennen, dass es total nützlich ist, manchmal den Ego-Tod zu sterben und anzuerkennen, okay, jetzt gerade muss ich mal aus dieser Rolle heraustreten und mal einfach anerkennen, dass ich Scheiße gebaut habe oder dass meine Schlussfolgerung falsch war oder so. Ich meine, das tut weh, aber das muss man machen. Man muss das kultivieren. Man braucht eine Kultur dafür. Und diese Kultur haben wir nicht. Wir haben sie nicht. Wir haben eine Kultur, die es belohnt, sich die ganze Zeit versuchen zu bestätigen. Das ist exakt das Gegenteil von Rationalität. Das ist exakt nicht das, was Wissenschaft ist. Wir haben aber eine Kultur, die sagt, du musst dich verkaufen auf Instagram. Und zwar, indem du die ganze Zeit recht hast. Und am besten trittst du gegen andere an, von denen du weißt, dass du gegen sie gewinnst, um höher im Status zu stehen, im sozialen Ranking. Das ist Fake. Das ist alles Schwachsinn. Es ergibt keinen Sinn. Und es ist, wie gesagt, nicht aufklärerisch.
That can feel like a very, very painful thing to do.
Flitzpiepe, ja. Pilze für Jugendweihe ist ein interessanter Gedanke. Ich habe den auch schon gehabt. Das ist nicht unbedingt, also das ist vielleicht ein Teil eines Initiationsritus, den ich mir gut vorstellen könnte, ja. Hallo JJ.
As our critical faculties develop, it can seem far easier to rationalize what we've absorbed by chance than to face the discomfort that comes with questioning. To question is to value the ideal of truth more highly than the loyalties to our nation, religion, race, or ideology. In short, our inherited identity.
Mhm.
I think the key to any progress is to ask the question why all the time. Why is that child poor? Why was there a war? Why was she killed? Why is she in power? And of course, questions can get you into a lot of trouble because society is trained by those who run it to accept what goes on. And if you keep asking questions, it's very destabilizing. And yet you have to do it. Without questions, you won't ever make any progress at all.
Tja, aber diese Rechenleistung, ne, die Rechenleistung kann ja unmöglich jeder für sich primär bringen, ne? Es wäre viel besser, wenn wir sie in einem transparenten kulturellen Prozess aufteilen würden. Denn niemand kann alles ausrechnen, ne? Das ist Schwachsinn. Ich meine, ich gebe mir ja schon beste Mühe, sozusagen, so viel wie möglich auf fundamentale Prozesse abbilden zu können. Das habe ich ja jetzt auch mit dem Buch gemacht und so, aber klar, also ich meine, niemand kann alles verstehen, das ist unmöglich. Wenn man einfach mal nur, sagen wir mal, sich Biologie drauf schaffen will, wie Biotope funktionieren, da kann man erstmal 20 Jahre lang sich was drauf schaffen. Im Detail.
Society establishes set paths for us to follow. Change depends on not only questioning
ja, du hast
these
recht.
paths, but creating alternatives.
Das wird gemacht, ich weiß.
The fruits of human creativity exist beyond the walls of galleries, libraries, and concert halls. The world is our most important canvas, and our choices our most important brushstrokes. If enough of us choose to use our intelligence and creativity to serve the values of democracy, equality,
Also, Ayahuasca, Nahtoderfahrung und so, das ist natürlich die eine Sache. Aber es gibt zum Beispiel Initiationsriten von so irgendwelchen Buschvölkern, wo die Jungs irgendwie mit 13 oder so einen Quest kriegen, von wegen, du gehst jetzt in den Dschungel und bringst irgendeinen Tiger um oder irgendwas richtig brutal Schwieriges. Ne? Und die scheißen sich richtig ein. Und es ist aber so angelegt, dass alle Erwachsenen des Stammes sozusagen das moderieren von außen. Ne? Die sind die ganze Zeit dabei, die gucken von außen drauf. Der Junge weiß das aber nicht. Und das Tier wird sozusagen auch auf eine Art und Weise so präpariert, dass das Kind wirklich sich in die Hose scheißt, es durchzieht und diese Erfahrung macht. Auf eine Art und Weise, die aber moderiert wird, ohne dass das Kind das mitkriegt. Ich habe davon gelesen, dass das sozusagen, also das gibt's, ne, in alten Kulturen, die sowas machen. Und das ist interessant, ne? Und nochmal, wir haben keinerlei Vorbilder und auch keinerlei Initiationsriten in unserer Kultur. Wir haben nur falsche Götzen. Sie bestehen aus Bitcoin-Bros und irgendwelchen Konsumentenscheiß.
quality and sustainability, together we can create something of great and lasting beauty.
To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect...
Christina, nein, das ist genau der Punkt. Ich glaube tatsächlich, Literatur ist es nicht. Fakten alleine bringen nur wenigen Leuten was. Ich denke, die meisten Leute müssen ganz dringend die Erfahrung machen. Sie müssen sie lebendig erfahren, diese Dinge. Es bringt ihnen nichts, nur davon zu lesen.
Strength, never power.
Die meisten Leute sind keine Theoretiker.
To try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.
Es ist eben nicht das Gleiche, Christina. Es ist nicht das Gleiche. Es ist überhaupt nicht das Gleiche. Ich meine, selbst ich könnte nicht 100% sagen, wie ich mich in irgendwelchen Extremsituationen verhalten würde. Auch wenn ich mir das jetzt vielleicht wünschen würde oder so. Auf keinen Fall ist es das Gleiche. Probieren geht immer über Studieren. Gerade wenn es um menschliche Dinge geht und zwischenmenschliche Dinge.
This being a very narrow understanding of activism. But real activism, in my view, is about engaging in transformation in every detail of your life. It includes the building of alternatives, but it also includes the creative transmission of ideas. And that is why real activism must go hand in hand with cultural transformation. I think Gandhi was really an artist. He was an artist because he could bring out a core issue in a very, very simple way. He could walk to the beach of Dandi and pick up the salt when the British wanted us to stop making salt. So
Christina, ich weiß nicht, was du mir sagen willst. Ich weiß nicht, wie das jetzt dem widerspricht, dass ich behaupte, wir haben keine Initiationsriten. Ja, die Frau hier ist based auf jeden Fall.
Royalties out of salt making. Just that act of picking a grain of salt is an artistic act. To be able to speak about freedom in a way that he could charge such a large humanity in India with the sense that they have the power, that too is an artistic act because it connects.
I think that the public have come to be cynical about the possibility of anything else. It means that they think that the deck is horribly stacked and their capacity to do anything about it is very limited, and that their focus has to be on the domain, the well-being of their family, that they can impact.
People with power always try to maintain the cynicism of those who don't have power. That is, maintain the idea that you can't really have any effect, so don't waste your time trying. Max Horkheimer said, well-informed cynicism is only another mode of conformity. I think cynicism is one of the isms that is most damaging to people, and cynicism is prevalent.
There's a sense of passivity and defeat in many people's minds and in their emotions.
Auf jeden Fall. Ich werde demnächst irgendwann ein Video machen zu dieser Coping-Strategie, die ich Pseudonihilismus nenne. Weil ich sehe das übelst viel bei übelst vielen Rechten und so Boys, so junge Boys, die irgendwie eigentlich Weltschmerz empfinden und damit nicht copen können, und dann behaupten sie einfach, es ist alles egal, sie sind Nihilisten. Und das stimmt halt überhaupt nicht, weil sie eigentlich die ganze Zeit am Heulen sind und so. Und das sind auch dieselben Leute, die sich dann über, keine Ahnung, irgendwelche Social Justice Warrior aufregen. Wenn sie Nihilisten wären, dann würden sie das nicht tun. So ein Schwachsinn. Das geht in diese Richtung.
It is not something which is intrinsic in the sense that it comes out of a genetic predisposition. It comes out of the ways in which the social order has succeeded in preying upon their insecurities.
You know, I think about the declining living standard we've had in the United States since the 1970s. And at each point along the road, millions of people viewed their declining living standard as a personal problem.
Mm-hmm.
They viewed it as, I'm not working hard enough. Maybe I need to work a second job. Maybe more members of my family need to work. Rather than recognizing that there was a systemic problem at stake. One of the first impulses is to try to accommodate oneself to an oppressive situation. And so, for example, you look at what we're facing with the current economic...
Christina, es funktioniert doch nicht, wenn man nicht davon überzeugt ist, dass es die Realität ist. Ich bitte dich. Erfahrungen müssen echt sein, damit sie funktionieren. Man kann sich nicht austricksen. Man kann so oft in den Puff gehen, wie man will, aber man wird nicht dem Tinder-Effekt erliegen und hinterher behaupten, dass die Nutte sich in einen verliebt hat. Das ist Schwachsinn.
crisis. And you would expect more resistance. But we have to keep in mind that for years, the average person certainly has been accommodating themselves to an increasingly difficult situation. They've been treating it individually. They've been treating it as if it's an individual problem. But the system.
Christina, nein, das kann nicht funktionieren. Ich meine, du bringst hier zum Beispiel das Theater an. Oder ich würde jetzt noch sowas sagen wie kapitalismuskritische Filme oder kapitalismuskritische Twitch-Streams. Das ist im Wesentlichen auf allererster Ebene erstmal ein Placebo. Also, wenn ich jetzt zum Beispiel ein Video darüber mache, dass wir den Ego-Tod sterben müssen, zum Beispiel, dass die männlichen Geschlechterrollen sozusagen, so wie sie sind, ein einziger LARP sind und die müssen sterben, dann ist das zwar schön, das zu hören, aber der Prozess in den Boys, und ich habe ja fast nur Boys als Zielgruppe, bis hin, dass sie ihren eigenen LARP hinterfragen, der ist damit noch nicht getan. Das muss man selber tun. Und das passiert erst in dem Moment, wo sie es machen, wo sie sich vielleicht selber dabei entdecken, dass sie patriarchale Denkmuster und strukturelle Diskriminierung reproduzieren. Klar kann ein Theaterstück das anfischen, aber das ist nicht dasselbe wie die Erfahrung machen. Man kann sich nicht selber verarschen. Und VR würde auch nicht funktionieren. Die meisten Leute brauchen ganz dringend die Erfahrung am eigenen Leib. Wir sind halt nun mal informationsverarbeitende Viecher. Und die Informationen, die bei uns reinkicken, und das zeigen auch die Studien, sind die wir wirklich erfahren. Da, wo die Realität mit im Spiel ist. Nicht irgendwelche fiktiven Sachen, die in Büchern stehen. Ne? Also, so wie mit dem Klimawandel. Ich meine, es muss erst richtig krachen, bevor das passiert, bevor wir uns da anpassen.
The system itself is toxic.
Most people know that everything is broken. They know that the society is skewed for the people at the top. They know that it's unjust. So then why don't they rebel? Why isn't it enough to point out how bad things are, to make perfectly clear to people the extent to which millions die unnecessarily each year of poverty and of starvation and of lack of medical equipment and also of bombs falling on their heads, of billions of people denied a degree of dignity and control over their lives and even the most meager resources with which to fulfill their capacities. Why isn't that enough? Well,
Zirkel, ja, dieses Inzest-Ding von wegen als Initiationsritus. Guck mal, ich meine, es ist wie bei der Kunst auch. Was Kunst macht, ist so, würfelt einfach irgendwas aus, ideengeschichtlich. Und ein paar Ideen werden aufgenommen, später von Mathematikern oder so, und damit wird irgendwas gemacht. Und viele Sachen droppen, weil sie sinnlos sind oder weil sie einfach mal völlig random ausprobiert wurden und nichts bringen. Ne? Und so sehe ich das da auch. Du hast halt für jeden Scheiß eine Kultur. Die Frage ist nur, bringt es irgendwas? Das, was bringt, so wie in evolutionären Sinne auch, überlebt den Evolutionsdruck. Ne, die Tatsache, dass sich Japaner getragene Mädchenschlüpfer anziehen, das bringt jetzt erstmal nichts. Aber es könnte doch sein, dass sozusagen aus irgendwelchen Urvölkern bestimmte Riten gar nicht mal so schlecht sind. Ne, das heißt ja nicht, dass es keine gibt, die schwachsinnig sind. Klar gibt es welche, die schwachsinnig sind.
The reason it isn't enough is because Margaret Thatcher can get up and say there is no alternative. Suppose I said that there was this phenomenon that was so harsh, so deadly, so debilitating that it was the biggest killer on the planet. It killed far more people than war. It killed far more people than poverty. It killed more people than war and poverty combined. War, poverty and sickness combined. And
Schmidtchen, natürlich die natürliche Selektion bestimmt das, ist doch klar. Weil wir ja selber immer noch nicht auf die Reihe kriegen, mal über Sachen nachzudenken ordentlich. Wir haben noch keine demokratischen Prozesse und Pläne auf der Skala, die das irgendwie relevant etablieren könnten, diesen Denkprozess.
I said, come join me in a movement against this. And then I said, I was talking about aging, which indeed does kill more people than anything else. And it limits us, and it restricts us, and it diminishes our options, and it diminishes our possibilities, and then it kills us. And if I said, come join me in a movement against it, you'd laugh at me. Everybody would laugh. They'd say, grow up, get a life.
Alle außer David Sinclair würden da lachen.
Face reality. There is no such thing as a movement against aging. That's ridiculous. That's the way most people see capitalism. That's the way most people see the world around us. That's the way they see the injustices. They think it's just a fact of life.
Yeah.
It's a part of existence. And so they think you just have to put up with it. This is a function of the educational system, of the positions that we find ourselves in, of the roles and the options that exist in society. We choose among that which is sort of put in front of us, which is made available to us. And if you do that often enough, you begin to forget that you could change the whole system.
Kommen so viele Physiker hier
I would
vor,
argue that what is really distinct about human nature is our capacity for self-transformation and for creating a world that we really want. We can change ourselves through our interaction with both our built as well as our social environment, and that is very, very, very important in ways that distinguish us from other species.
For me, human nature is very marginally understood, but some things are certainly very clear. We have bilateral symmetry. We have 2 arms and 2 legs. We have various organs that we know about. Those things are all wired in. They're part of our nature as human beings. We also have minds. That's wired in. Our cognitive capacity is wired in. We are capable of solidarity. We are capable of mutual aid. We are capable of expressing our desires and acting upon them. We are capable of acting in a socially desirable fashion. We're also capable of the reverse of all
Ronnes, das ist Whataboutism, das weißt du, ne?
those things. So the question becomes, if you're thinking about a vision for a better society, what do? Do you structure a society in such a way that it promotes and provokes and sustains those qualities and characteristics that we abhor? Or do you create a society that furthers the qualities that we like?
If you limit your study of history.
Also es ist deswegen Whataboutism, weil du es den Frauen vorwirfst, ne? Und das ist Schwachsinn. Wir haben halt eine Welt, in der sozusagen niemand aufgeklärt ist. Und da werden die Easy Wins genommen. Zum Beispiel Licht anmachen. Oder Antibabypille, die ja richtig viele Nachteile hat. Nicht nur das. Richtig viele. Und es ist auch nicht notwendig, ne? Man braucht das nicht. Aber es ist eine kasualisierte Kapitalismusvariante einer sogenannten Problemlösung. So wie die Tatsache, dass wir im Patriarchat leben und Gewaltverbrechen gegen Frauen verübt werden. Das ist halt auch so ein Ding. Ne? Wir haben halt eine kaputte Society. Und da werden diese oberflächlichen Lösungen halt gerne genommen, weil da profitieren auch noch Leute davon.
The revelations of brutality and war and exploitation, it can be very depressing. And it can be so depressing that it immobilizes you. That's why it is important to study not just the history of the terrible things that have happened, but study the history of how people have struggled against that. How the indigenous people in the United States fought back against the white invader. How black slaves rebelled against their masters. How working people went on strike against the corporations that dominated their lives. And how in many of these cases, these struggles resulted in victory. And what happens when you study that history, you find different kinds of heroes to emulate. You no longer have the heroes that were given to you in school, the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, or the great industrialists, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, the military heroes, you know. You learn, for instance, that Mark Twain was not simply an important and gifted novelist, but he was a leader of the anti-imperialist movement in the United States, protesting against the war in the Philippines. You learn about heroic people who then become examples. You learn about Emma Goldman, the anarchist, feminist, outrageous person who was jailed so many times, but who insisted on, as she put it, living her own life. Yes, people living their own lives, people who refused to be cowed, whether they lost or won, they refused.
Ja, Emma Goldman, richtig based Person übrigens. Habe ich vor 3 Tagen erst noch einen Aufsatz von ihr gelesen.
To be
Zur weiblichen Lust.
by whatever society was going to do to them. And those are inspiring stories. To tell that, I think, is an antidote to being depressed by exploitation and conquest and war.
Und im Prinzip ging es um Identitätspolitik und den Fake-Feminismus von irgendwelchen Linksliberalen. Bloß, dass damals diese Worte noch nicht existiert haben, zu Emma Goldmans Zeiten. Schon interessant.
I think one reason it is so important to break out of the prison of the monoculture of the mind is to recognize that this world has so many alternatives.
Mhm.
There's so many alternatives to the industrial agriculture based on fossil fuels and chemicals. There's so many alternatives to a banking system based on fraud. There's so many alternatives to the unrepresentative representative democracy. We live under conditions of deep economic insecurity. And this kind of economic insecurity, of course, is depriving people of basic needs, but it is also the fertile ground for cultures of hatred, cultures of violence, cultures of killings. If we just want our children to grow up in a culture of peace, we need to be sure we work and build the alternatives that will create that culture of peace for future generations. What keeps me going is some very basic things. One, I know I'm part of this beautiful planet, of this universe, and I must play my role in it. I am connected, and therefore I do what needs to be done. If biodiversity has to be protected, I'll protect it. If rivers like the Ganges have to be protected, I'll protect them. The second thing that keeps me going is an abhorrence for injustice. I think every human being needs to have security, freedom, and dignity. And every time it's violated, I want to be there to make sure that violation doesn't take place. And the third thing that keeps me going is really the beauty of this world, the beauty of people. And I'd rather participate in building on that beauty than see the ugliness of devastation, of forests torn down by bulldozers, of rivers rubbished by waste dumping, and people rubbished by an economy that has no place for them. So beauty, for sure, is a very more important part of what keeps me going.
Christina, auch du darfst mal getriggert sein. Welcome.
What we create tomorrow depends on what we do today.
Die Boyhood ist stark.
To create an alternative future, we cannot reproduce the thinking that shaped our past. And yet we will, if we do not challenge the forces that have shaped who we are and what we do. To identify the limitations on our knowledge, freedom, and happiness is to give ourselves the best chance of transcending them. The more we understand the effect the world has had on us, the more we can control the effect we have on the world.
I can't think my generation made much of a success of the world. 2 world wars and the atomic bomb. And so in a way I feel when I talk to younger people I have to be, in a way, start with an apology. Say you have the decision to either destroy the human race or...
Ich weiß nicht, JJ, also ich denke, das Ding ist sozusagen, wir in der ersten Welt haben so eine Art Paralyse kultiviert, in der wir die überschüssige Zeit, die wir tatsächlich haben, also jedes bisschen Freizeit zum Beispiel, dank mangelnder Kapazitäten eher in Konsum und Cheap Thrills übersetzen. Ne? Dabei gäbe es natürlich physikalisch die Möglichkeit, mehr zu tun. Ne? Die Frage ist sozusagen, meistens sind wir uns allen unserer eigentlichen Entscheidungsräume gar nicht bekannt. Also bewusst. Was wir sozusagen, wie viel wir zum Beispiel lokal in der Nachbarschaft erschaffen könnten. Ne? Und das hat sozusagen vor allem damit zu tun, dass man sich gar nicht bewusst ist, was für ein Potenzial in den Entscheidungen überhaupt drin liegt, so richtig. Das ist wirklich schwierig, weil wir halt kultiviert wurden, in einer solchen Paralyse zu leben. Und ich meine, nur die wenigsten Leute sind, glaube ich, wirklich gut dazu geeignet, weiß ich nicht. Also ich meine, man sieht es ja zum Beispiel im Twitch. Die meisten Creators sind irgendwie Leute, die verschiedene Zielgruppen abtasten, aber viele sind sehr gleich. Ne? Und die kopieren sich eigentlich alle gegenseitig. Und wenn sie nicht wissen, was sie machen sollen, kopieren sie einfach einen englischen YouTuber oder so. Und diese Form von Redundanz zum Beispiel, die ist nicht hilfreich. Und es ist auch nicht hilfreich für die Leute, die sie konsumieren, weil die eher diese Illusion haben, ich gucke mir das was an, was der und der und der zu sagen hat, obwohl alle drei gleich sind oder so. Und das ist halt so, uns fehlen sozusagen die Schnittstellen zur echten Welt. Ne? Viel zu viele Leute leben wirklich zu viel im Internet drin. Und jetzt mal so eine Gewerkschaftsarbeit zum Beispiel. Oder so ein Projekt, wo man sagt, okay, ich versuche so weit wie möglich auszusteigen, indem ich in einem Wohnprojekt lebe. Das ist ein Riesenschritt. Einfach nur Wohnen anders zu denken, ist schon ein Riesenschritt. Und das ist möglich. Das kann jeder machen. Das kann man vor allem dann machen, wenn man wirklich armutsbetroffen ist, weil sozusagen aus dieser Not viele solcher Lösungen erst emergieren.
Put us on a right course. What decision are you going to take?
Ja, wenn man sich mit Videos Mühe gibt, dann ist das wirklich anstrengend, das stimmt.